Welcome to the latest episode of MQ's podcast. And we're absolutely delighted that today at An Open Mind, Craig and I have got Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore. So welcome to the podcast, Sarah-Jayne, and thanks a million
Thank
for
you.
joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome in.
So Sarah-Jayne, as what we're hoping to do, what we try to do with the podcast is just an informal conversation. What we like to begin with is take our listeners and viewers on a wee bit of a journey of how your interest in sort of mental health evolved. I think as yours is a bit of an evolution, I think, in terms of my understanding of your career, starting off and the work you did in schizophrenia, I think in your PhD work, and then moving on then obviously to the adolescent work. But maybe can you maybe start us with the beginning of your journey? You obviously did your undergraduate degree, I think, at Oxford.
Yeah, I did a degree in experimental psychology, and I was always interested in mental health, even though back then, in the 90s, we didn't really talk about it as much. But my mum had really severe depression from the age of, I don't know, 12 or 13 or something, and other mental health problems also run in my family. So I was very aware of those kinds of mental health problems. We didn't really use the term mental health, but certainly the word depression was used a lot. And so I had a deep interest in psychology and mental processes, which is why I decided to do a psychology degree. And then in my psychology degree, I became particularly interested in schizophrenia and the brain basis of symptoms that are experienced by people with schizophrenia and psychosis, like symptoms like hearing voices, auditory hallucinations, and being really paranoid, so paranoid delusions. I became interested in those symptoms and the question of why do they occur in people with schizophrenia and why don't they occur in all the rest of us? Why don't we all hear voices inside our heads, for example, interpreting our own thoughts as an external voice? Why don't we all have these paranoid delusions? And that's what I decided to do my PhD on. I did my PhD at UCL with Chris Frith and Daniel Wolpert, and we looked at just that. So how we, in people who don't have schizophrenia, how we label our own actions and thoughts as our own, how the brain does that, how it predicts the consequences of our own actions and thoughts, and how that can go wrong in people who suffer from these quite debilitating symptoms in psychosis.
And then then you did the PhD work, and then because I might be wrong, but you didn't proceed with that. And
that's right. Okay, so
you did some time in France, I think, in between, I think, and
yeah, and in France, I did continue to work on schizophrenia. I tested lots more patients in Paris, and I was working mostly in Lyon, but I was working in psychiatric hospitals in Paris. And it was at that point, this was the early 2000s, that I became really interested in the fact that whenever I was testing a patient with schizophrenia in a hospital, I would ask them as part of the interview that I did with them, when did you start experiencing these symptoms? So when did you start experiencing hearing voices and being more paranoid than made sense? And there wasn't a single exception. In the hundreds of patients I tested, both in the UK and in France, every one of them said at some age between 18 and about 26, 27. And I became really interested in why that is. What is it about teenage brain development that is different in teenagers who go on to develop schizophrenia compared with teenagers who don't? And at that point, again, in the early 2000s, I looked at the scientific literature and I was really surprised to find almost nothing was known about how the human brain developed during adolescence, during the teenage years and in early adulthood. There were a couple of papers then, only two, and they suggested that the brain does continue to develop rather substantially during adolescence. And at that point, that's when I thought I would try to change the trajectory of my own research focus and look at the development of the teenage brain. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
And so was your initial plan, though, okay, you moved into the adolescent age group, but had you initially thought, oh, I might stay within the schizophrenia, sort of the whatever severe end of mental health problems, or had you at that stage decided to look more broadly?
Well, I think most people do end up staying quite linked to what they did their PhD on. And so the departure to something completely different was a big risk. But I decided to take it, and I had encouragement from my mentors, like Uta Frith in particular, just really encouraged me to take this risk because she could also see this gap in the evidence base. But yes, also, I think in some ways I started, when I think back, I think when I started to work on adolescent brain development, I think my plan was to find out how the typically developing adolescent brain changes, and then find out how the brain develops in teenagers who develop something like schizophrenia or other mental health problems. Now, I mean, I haven't got anywhere near that, because there are still so many questions to ask about even just the typically developing mentally healthy brain and how it develops. And other labs around the world are focusing on brain development in teenagers who develop mental health problems.
Yeah, but obviously the contribution you've made is immense, and we'll talk about that shortly. And in terms of our understanding of the complexity of the brain development, the social brain, and I suppose, and I think I've heard you say this before. I mean, when you started out, and I remember this as an undergraduate doing psychology a few years before you, was at that stage we had believed that the brain had stopped developing certainly way before the adolescent period, and obviously the work you and others have done has really shown how wrong we were. So do you maybe because that means such a step change in our understanding. So you would tell us a bit about that.
Well, yeah. So when I was an undergraduate in the mid-90s, in my developmental neurobiology lectures, I was taught that the human brain stops developing in late childhood. I remember being taught that, and also I
remember being taught it as well. Yeah.
I remember being taught that, and I kept my undergraduate textbooks, and I have them still, and that's exactly what they say. They do, some of them have a line in about some data collected by someone called Peter Huttenlocher on post-mortem human brain tissue, suggesting that maybe some regions like the prefrontal cortex develop until 18. That's I have to acknowledge that work was done back in the 60s and 70s, but that was kind of glossed over. And the general consensus was the brain is fully formed by late childhood. And I think, and we now know that is absolutely not the case. The brain develops very dramatically through childhood, of course, but it doesn't stop in late childhood. It continues to develop in a very substantial and protracted way right throughout the teenage years and into the 20s and even the early 30s. I think the reason why people assumed that the human brain stops developing in late childhood was, first of all, because they didn't have the technology to look inside the living human brain. We now have MRI scanning, which is a technology that allows us to do just that and to track changes in brain structure and brain function across the lifespan. But also because, interestingly, the human brain becomes about adult size. So if you just measure the cranium, if you just measure the overall brain volume, it becomes about adult size by around age 8 or 9 in humans. So maybe that's why this myth that it stops developing completely around that time was so prevalent. And of course, it does not change very much in volume, in overall volume at all after age 8 or 9, but the internal composition of the brain changes very dramatically.
And what sense, so the pruning and all that continues to happen, and maybe say a bit about then actually what are the changes in terms of the structural links and the functional links as well?
Masses is changing in the brain during adolescence. We know that the grey matter, which is mostly found in the cortex, the surface of the brain, is changing in terms of volume, so it increases during childhood and then undergoes a very, very big decline during adolescence right into the 20s. And at the same time that the grey matter in the cortex is declining in adolescence, white matter is increasing very significantly right throughout adolescence into the 20s and 30s. And well, one interesting question is like, what underlies those changes in grey matter and white matter? Why does grey matter decline? Why does white matter increase in adolescence? And we can only really make educated guesses based on animal research and post-mortem human brain tissue research. But that research suggests that the decline in grey matter volume and the increase in white matter volume are due to really important neurodevelopmental processes that are going on during that time. And that's really important because sometimes when I say, oh, grey matter declines in adolescence, people interpret that as a kind of degeneration or atrophy. It's not that at all. It reflects the progress of really important neurodevelopmental processes. So things like axonal growth and myelination, they're just jargon terms, but what they mean is the fibers that are in the middle of the brain that allow different regions of the brain to communicate with each other. Those fibers are what we call white matter when we view them in MRI scans. And they're the fibers along which electrical impulses pass. So whenever you do anything, whenever you feel anything, whenever you perceive anything at all, electrical impulses or action potentials are passing along those fibers, those axons. In development, those axons become wider and they also become coated with a fatty substance called myelin. And both of those processes, the increase in diameter of the fiber and the coating with myelin, effectively increases the speed of transmission of electrical signals down the axon. So the brain becomes more efficient and more speedy. And that process is happening for several decades in humans. And those two processes, in MRI, they are viewed as an increase in white matter, and that's because the myelin is white if you look at it in a microscope, and it's coded as white matter in MRI scans, and a concomitant decrease in grey matter. So we see this deep decline in grey matter. It's not that grey matter is really being lost, it's just changing into white matter. Another neurobiological process that's really important and happens during both childhood and adolescence is a reorganization of the synapses. So they're the connections between cells across which neurotransmitters like serotonin or dopamine pass. And in development, the brain produces way too many synapses. It overproduces synapses, so that a young child or young animal's brain contains many, many more synapses than an adult brain contains. So then the next process after
just to jump in there, I was always curious as what thing is at uni was, so what's the function of the overproduction, first of all? What function does it serve in the younger brain?
Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to get to next.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's a really, really good question. It's the crucial question. So the brain produces way too many synapses. So then the next step is that the brain needs to whittle down that excess number of synapses to adult levels. And it does that, and this is the answer to your question, based on the environmental input that the young person or young animal is experiencing. So it does that dependent partly, it's partly genetic, but it's partly dependent on the environment, in that synapses that are being used in a particular environment are the synapses that remain in the brain and grow stronger. And synapses that are not being used in a particular environment, well, they're just wasting the brain's resources. So they're the synapses that the brain gets rid of and eliminates in a process called synaptic pruning. So these neurodevelopmental processes that underlie the changes in grey matter and white matter in the brain during adolescence are processes of neuromechanisms, if you like, of neuroplasticity. That is the way the brain changes according to the environment it's growing up in. And so we think of childhood and adolescence as periods of increased neuroplasticity, where the brain is particularly sensitive and susceptible to environmental input.
And we'll come back to some of the susceptibilities in the real world in a few minutes' time. But just the last bit on this is thinking about early life trauma and epigenetic effects and so on. So what do we know about the relationship between what is happening in your external environment to that pruning process? To what extent is it affected by those external pressures?
Yes, there's a lot of evidence for that. There's direct evidence from animal research where you can actually manipulate the environment that an animal's growing up in and look at how that is affecting its brain and its cognitive development and behavioral development. And we also know from some more observational or epidemiological studies in humans that that's also the case, that the environment that the human is growing up in can affect the way that child's brain develops. So I'll give you one example from the animal literature. So all animals undergo a period of adolescence between going through puberty and becoming fully sexually mature adults. And you can study brain development and behavior in adolescent animals. So, for example, mice and rats, which tend to be the animal that's studied in this area, they go through about 35 days of adolescence. And in those 35 days, you can see things like increased risk-taking, increased impulsivity, very big changes in social behavior, where they become more independent from their parents or mother, and they're attracted towards peers, and also huge changes in the brain as well. And you can change the environment of those animals in their adolescent period and look at how that affects brain and behavioral development compared with the same changes either before puberty or in adulthood. One example of this that's really well researched is isolation, so social isolation. If you isolate rats or mice in adolescence, that has a bigger and arguably more damaging effect on brain development and behavioral development, so things like reward seeking, reward learning, risk taking, than the same form of isolation either before puberty or in adulthood. So that suggests that adolescence, at least in animal models, is a sensitive period for social interaction, and isolation has significant effects.
And so obviously we know there's been a lot of work on loneliness, especially in the adolescent period. And there's some evidence, certainly from, I'm just thinking of some of the recent COVID data, which showed really elevated levels of loneliness in adolescents compared to other age groups. And I know you've been doing other work on loneliness as well, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, that our work on loneliness was partly based on the animal research showing that social isolation has particularly profound effects in adolescents compared with other ages. Now, there's a lot of work in animals, but of course, in humans, it's quite difficult to do that research because it's not, obviously wouldn't be ethical to, manipulate the environment in that way for human adolescents for a long period of time. But we know lots of worrying things partly from your work and other people's work, that at the moment, and particularly during the pandemic, people do self-report being very lonely. But actually, even before the pandemic, there was a very big BBC-led survey done on loneliness in this country where people self-reported loneliness. And to the surprise of everyone, I think, the group of people who reported being most lonely were young people aged 16 to 24. And that's been replicated several times since, not just in this country, but in other countries around the world as well, which is an interesting phenomenon. And we should probably come back to that. But in the pandemic, it got particularly bad, of course. I mean, I suppose you could call it the natural experiment of social isolation. We weren't allowed to go out of our houses, and schools were closed, so young people couldn't interact with their peers in real life as much as they were used to. So we were really interested in how that form of, or how loneliness and social isolation affects adolescent behavior and mental health based on what we knew from the animal research. And together with a postdoc in my group at the time, Dr. Livia Tomova, she's now at Cardiff University, and a PhD student in my group, Emily Towner, and our research assistant, Kirsten Thomas, we carried out an experimental study of social isolation on young people. Now, it wasn't a long period of social isolation. It was a few hours. It was about four hours on average in a room where they were completely on their own. They were isolated, but this was quite a nice room. It had a fridge. It had lots of puzzles to do. It was right next to a bathroom. It had a skylight, but there was just no social interaction. And in one of the sessions, they weren't allowed to bring their phones. They weren't even allowed to bring any books that had people in, so no novels, nothing social at all. And in another session, it was exactly the same room, but they were allowed to bring their phones or their iPads or their laptops or whatever. So they could communicate with other people, but only online. So that was like a social media condition. And we compared that with a baseline condition where they hadn't been isolated at all. And we looked at the outcome of isolation on various different cognitive and behavioral processes based on what we knew from the literature in animals, from the evidence from animals, like risk-taking and reward-seeking. And we found that in the conditions in which they were socially isolated, and particularly in the condition where they had absolutely no ability to interact with the outside world at all, so no phones, no laptops, that affected reward seeking. They became more reward seeking and more risk taking compared with baseline, which is absolutely in line with what we know from the animal literature. And it suggests that loneliness affects our reward system. And that's also what we already knew from the animal literature. Being isolated, being lonely affects the human reward system, even in adolescence, even just a very, very short period of isolation, just a few hours. Well, we did various different reward-seeking experimental tasks.
It was task-based.
So we did, for example, like an effort-based reward-seeking task. How much effort are you willing to put in to see a reward? And the reward is very kind of minimal experimental reward. We also looked at how social isolation and loneliness affect mental health. So the social isolation, firstly, it increased loneliness as we expected it would, but it also decreased kind of positive mood. and increased anxiety a little bit. So this is just 4 hours of
Yeah.
social isolation. So, more chronic social isolation. Well, we know from epidemiological studies that social isolation and loneliness in humans is a very significant risk factor for the development of mental health problems. And the problem is it then becomes kind of cyclical, because if you have a mental health problem, you're more likely to isolate yourself and become isolated from other people, which then makes things worse.
Yeah, no, and we've done some work led with my colleague Heather McClellan to show the link with loneliness and suicide risk as well. I mean, it's devastating. I just think that loneliness, I hate using the word pandemic in that context, but in terms of worldwide grand challenges and globally, we need to tackle loneliness, because as we well know, all the epidemiological evidence will tell us what loneliness is equivalent to smoking, what is it, 15 cigarettes a day in terms of mortality. So I think it's something we really need to address. Right, so we've gone around
I
this.
actually I really agree with you. And I do think, I mean, there's less kind of hard evidence in this space, but I do think it's interesting to think, and people like Jonathan Haidt and others have made this point very, very well and strongly, that the increase in loneliness in young people over the last 15 years correlates with the increase in social media use and smartphone use over the same time period. And we don't know the causality, and it's very probably bidirectional, actually. So if you're lonely, then you're more likely to be on your phone as well as the other way around. But I do think it's a very important thing to consider. Like, we all have phones, most of us on social media. You feel very exposed to other people all the time. You're constantly looking at other people's social media feeds. But that doesn't make you feel less lonely. In fact, it might make you feel perhaps more lonely and isolated if you're seeing the amazing lives that, the curated lives that other people are having online. And I don't know, if you're a young person, if you're looking at party photos of parties that you haven't been invited to and other kind of social events that you're not part of, that could make you feel very lonely. And that's something that is impossible to avoid if you're on social media.
I suppose I agree with that, but I think we need to be really careful. I get really frustrated with the media narrative around social media and mental health. And obviously, your good colleague Amy Orban has done great work in this space. And it's a really complicated relationship. And as you say, at least it'll be certainly bi-directional. And I think all the evidence would suggest the effect it has is probably on those who are already vulnerable. And I think that bit's often missed in the discussion. And
I
but we
think
might
that's
come back to
right.
social media unless you've something on it, like Sarah-Jayne.
Well, let's come back to social media.
Okay, we'll come back because I will do it, because actually we sort of got a wee bit sidetracked. We got, which is good. So we got as far as you did. We got how you
It's my special skill, becoming sidetracked.
So we got to France, going in your career trajectory. I'm trying to bring us to
Whoa,
your current role. But your current role is obviously you're chair of psychology and the social sciences at Cambridge University, and you lead the developmental cognitive neuroscience group. I think you moved to Cambridge, it's about 5 years ago?
Yeah, just before the pandemic in 2019.
It's a great time to move.
Yeah, amazing.
But so tell us about, so you obviously prior to that, you spent a lot of time, was it, how many years was it you were at UCL?
Oh yeah, I was at UCL for probably about 16, 17 years. Yes. I was at UCL, based at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, and I had a series of Royal Society fellowships that allowed me to do this research on adolescence. So it was quite interesting, actually, going back to trying to change fields. So maybe, some people out there might be trying to change fields or might have considered it and whether it's worth it. And it's actually very, like I said, it's a high risk thing to do, and it's really hard, just like most high risks. Research, it's hard to get funding to change fields, and I found that. So it was just after my first postdoc, which was a welcome postdoctoral fellowship back in the early 2000s. I wrote a couple of grant applications, basically proposing to change fields and study brain development in adolescence. And I put down all the reasons why this is important in order to understand how mental health problems develop, because adolescence is a vulnerable period for mental health problems. And I got at least one grant application like complete outright rejection, because first of all, I kept the reviews. They're quite funny to read now. The reviews were saying that it's too high risk, because I had never done any developmental work before. So it was a high risk for that reason, but also because they argued that if you want to look at brain development, then you really need to look at, infants or young children, because the brain doesn't develop, nothing develops much in adolescence. That was their argument. And that is kind of an interesting thing to experience. well, especially because we now know that absolutely huge amounts of brain and cognitive processes do change dramatically during adolescence. Anyway, the Royal Society did take the risk on me, and they funded my research transition to this new field. And I was then funded by them for another 16 years at UCL
Yeah,
before
and
moving
so
to
never looked
Cambridge.
back. So that's a good example of taking the risk, and it paid off for you.
Sometimes risks pay off.
Yeah, indeed. So, okay, so that's thinking about what I love about your work is you obviously do that amazing basic science, you do the applications of science, you do trying to understand how it impacts in policy and so on as well. Maybe we'll touch on a few minutes about what your recommendations are to educators, because I know you've done a lot of sort of advocacy in this space. But again, if there's a non sort of scientist specialist listening to this, so what would you say in terms of our misunderstandings of adolescence, right? And we sort of touched on some of it there in terms of, we mentioned risk taking, we mentioned social media use and so on, and loneliness. But maybe could you tell us something about what would you say are the key take homes, what are the most commonly misunderstood or the misconceptions about adolescence? And before you
Well,
answer that, I should plug your book, obviously, which is a great book, award-winning book, which 2018, Inventing Ourselves, whatever the secret. Is it
life of
Secret
the
Mind?
teenage brain.
Was it the secret?
It's the
Teen,
inventing ourselves, the secret life of the teenage
Secret
brain.
Life. I couldn't remember the life. Secret Life of the Teen Spirit, which is a great read and won the Royal Society Award, BPS Award, and the Hay Festival Award. It's an amazing book.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I mean, there are loads of myths about adolescence, and actually, they start. But you could read historical descriptions of this age group and you see exactly the same kind of stereotypes and myths that prevail today. So if you go back as far as Socrates and Aristotle, they are very, very negative about, they write a lot about what they call youth, and they're very negative about them. They say things like they have bad manners, they're impulsive, they're apt to be carried away by their impulses, all sorts of negative things that are touching on behaviors like risk taking and impulsivity and making bad decisions and being rude to adults. Exactly the same kind of stereotypes that we have for teenagers today. Throughout literature, you can see that those stereotypes. Shakespeare was full of them, and they're very, very prevalent. And I think that they're stereotypes that are based in, like all stereotypes, there's a certain amount of truth in them. Like adolescents do show a higher propensity to take risks than other age groups. That's absolutely unequivocal. You can show it and see it in many, many different ways. You can see it in the lab. You can see it in epidemiological data. You can see it in things like, driving risk data. Young people have a far disproportionate number of car accidents than any other age group, and not just because of inexperience, although that will be part of it, but also another aspect to this is peer influence. And that's something that, again, the ancient Greeks and Shakespeare and other writers picked up on. Young people are particularly drawn towards the attitudes of their peers, their friends, and they show a particular propensity to be influenced by their friends, particularly but not only in the context of risk taking. So going back to driving risks, young people are much more likely to have a car accident if they're carrying passengers in the car with them compared with if they're not. You can see that again from car insurance company data, from driving charity data, but also from lab-based studies, this peer influence on risk taking. Now, you asked me this question. You asked me what are the kind of myths and stereotypes about adolescence. These myths and stereotypes are based in some form of kind of average phenomenon. But what they miss out on, I think, is the huge individual differences in adolescence. That those are much less well understood. Some adolescents are very risk averse. Some adolescents are very resistant to peer influence. And then you have everything in between. And those kinds of individual differences in some ways are more interesting than the averages, but we too, like in most areas of science, we do tend to focus on the averages. Same with brain development. Anyone who works on brain development, we plot these lovely, beautiful lines showing, average change in grey matter, which would look like that, or average change in white matter volume during adolescence. But if you plot the raw data, it's a huge mess of data points, people going in all sorts of, very big differences in overall volumes of white matter and grey matter, but also in the slopes, like what age things change. And we really need to get better at understanding what those individual differences mean.
And have you any idea about what's our best guess at this stage in terms of
Well, you can ask questions like, if we stick with the brain development, why people's brains develop very differently. Overall, they all kind of go more or less in the same direction, but there are huge individual differences. And why is that? From like, is it what's causing those differences? Is it their genetics? Is it the environment
yeah,
they grow up in? I mean, environment is huge. There are lots of different ways environment can affect brain development, and probably both of those things are true. It's probably both partly genetic and environmental. And the other thing we can ask is, well, what are the consequences of those differences in brain development? If you're someone whose, say, cortex develops earlier than someone else, so say your cortex develops most dramatically in your early teens and someone else, their cortex develops most dramatically in their late teens, what does that mean in terms of outcomes? For example, are these differences in brain developmental trajectories predictive of developing mental health problems, for example? Or are they predictive of being more susceptible to environmental input? And those are kinds of questions that people are starting to ask, but it's really just the beginning.
yeah. And I suppose going back to your earlier point, though, I suppose the key misunderstanding, though, is in terms of the risk taking, but it's adolescents are behaving as their brain is dictating to them to behave. It's obviously it's developmentally appropriate to risk take, to boundary push, and so on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's absolutely. So these kinds of behaviors, we think of them as adaptive. And again,
Yeah.
going back to the animals, if you look at risk-taking, the development of risk-taking in animals across all species that have been studied, you see increased risk-taking, increased exploration of the environment, increased impulsivity in adolescence. There's an adaptive evolutionary
Mhm.
reason that we do that as adolescents. Probably, I mean, this is, evolutionary biology theories, and I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but probably because adolescence ultimately is the period of life in which we have to become an independent adult. So we
Yeah.
need to become gradually independent from our caregivers, from our parents, from our families, and affiliate with our peer groups, our peer networks, try and work out where we are in the complex social hierarchy so that we can forge social connections with our peers. And that's really important for becoming ultimately an independent adult, which is the whole point of this period of development that we call adolescence. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think there are adaptive reasons for this.
Which we know obviously believes goes on until mid-20s and whatever. So so that just then linked to that then is the work you've done on sort of how we think about the identity development work and how that identity develops over the adolescent period. So what do we know about what the brain development and the sort of environmental influences? How does that affect identity development? And that's, as you say, that sense of self.
So one important aspect of adolescence is to develop your sense of self-identity, and
Mhm.
particularly your sense of social self. That is how
Yeah.
other people see you. I mean, if you think about your own adolescence, your own teenage years, for most people, this is the age in which they suddenly develop their sense of, say, fashion. And it might have changed dramatically since then, but it's when suddenly fashion becomes quite important for a lot of
Yeah.
kids. Music taste, which peer group you want to hang out with, what kind of adolescent you want to be. Even things like political beliefs and moral beliefs take on a kind of step change in importance. And that's because all these elements of your life are characteristics that define you to other people. They
Mhm.
establish you as a certain type of person in your social context. And that's what is really important for adolescents to do, to establish who they are, their self-identity, with the ultimate goal of becoming an independent adult in society.
Yeah, and I suppose again, what frustrates me when we see well, I mean, when I think back to my adolescence, obviously, yeah, I agree with all that. But I think when I compare the way the media representations of adolescence in the 80s, 70s and 80s, well, I was an adolescent in the 80s and 90s, but there seems to be the demonization of adolescence, I think, has got worse. And that oh you don't you agree, you may not agree, well, that's my reflection on it. I definitely think that the narrative around adolescence has changed now. It might be because I was brought up in Northern Ireland and maybe we had other stuff going on, and maybe it's slightly different, but I definitely think that you don't think that, you think it's got better, have you, do you?
Well, I don't think it's got better, no, but I think it's always been there. And it's
Okay.
very, very interesting to consider why. I think this demonization of adolescence, particularly adolescent boys and young men, but not only, is something that society has always done, including going back 2,500 years to Aristotle and Socrates, for example. And it's really, I don't know the reason why. And I've thought about it a lot, about why it seems to be kind of socially acceptable for us to demonize and particularly mock adolescents, mock teenagers. It's funny, it is funny, but like, why is that acceptable? Because it's not really acceptable to mock others or demonize other sectors of society. We don't like that. But it is perfectly acceptable to do it about young people. And why, I don't know. I mean, perhaps we feel kind of threatened by youth somehow.
Yeah, or maybe
As
it's
adults.
about keeping youth in their place or something. I don't know. Maybe
Well,
something like that.
yeah, and they go from being little children who sort of more or less do what they're told and don't have much agency or autonomy, to actually very quickly being young people who want much more agency and autonomy. And again, that's another aspect of adolescence. Adolescents strive for agency and autonomy. And that's quite hard as society to cope with, and maybe demonizing and mocking them is a way to cope with that somehow psychologically.
That is interesting. And then, so, I mean, you've also done work on social rejection in adolescence, and just think that in this context of the challenging period that adolescence is. We've got this mismatch between there's a lot of cognitive development, emotional development, new experiences, all going on in this melange of whatever flux. And one of the things we know from the work you and others have done is that heightened period of social rejection. So what do we know about that relationship between social rejection and well-being more generally, and risk-taking and so on?
So we for many years we've worked on peer influence on adolescent decision making. So I already mentioned that adolescents show a heightened propensity to take risks when they're with their peers. I mean, that's something that's quite well known. If you think about the risks that we worry about adolescents taking, like smoking and now vaping, binge drinking, taking drugs, dangerous driving, those are risks that adolescents don't tend to take when they're on their own. It's when they're with their friends. And it's really hard for adolescents to resist that kind of peer influence. So some of our work has shown that adolescents are particularly sensitive to being socially excluded. So, I mean, none of us likes to be socially excluded. It's not nice not to be invited to things or socially excluded in other ways. But adolescents are particularly sensitive. They have particularly negative mood, for example, and increased anxiety if they're socially excluded. So if you think about adolescent decision making, if they're particularly negatively affected by the prospect of being socially rejected, then the prospect of being socially excluded or socially rejected is really aversive. So they'll do everything they can to avoid that and instead to be included by their social group, including going along with the whatever decisions are being made at the time. So if we put this in more concrete terms, if you think about, let's say, a teenage girl, all her friends are smoking around her at the weekend and they offer her a cigarette. Well, what's the more risky decision for her to make in that context? Saying yes to a cigarette, even though or a vape or whatever, even though she knows very well the health risks that carries, or saying no and potentially ostracizing herself from her peer group? Well, we would argue that for an adolescent who really is motivated to avoid the negative feelings of being socially excluded or rejected, then those kinds of risky decisions, when with peers, make kind of logical, rational sense. That's not to condone them. I don't think that it's a good thing. Young people
Just an
are more likely
explanation.
to, but it sheds those kinds of decisions in a more rational light, because often parents and teachers say to me, what we don't understand is why, we educate these kids all the time about the health risks of taking drugs or whatever, and yet they still do it. They're really intelligent kids. Why do they do it? Well, they do it for other social reasons. And actually, over the years of studying peer influence on adolescent decision making, I've kind of changed my view of adolescent risk taking. And actually, I think of adolescents as really quite risk averse, but they're risk averse when it comes to taking social risks. They don't want to they're very avoidant of taking any kind of risk that might result in social exclusion, which is what we call social risk. Even if that means that they end up taking health risks or physical risks, they've avoided taking a social risk.
So that's the dominant driver is the social environment or the social risk.
Yeah, exactly. I think with Kate Mills and Annalisa Goddings, who worked with me many years ago. Kate's now at Oregon University and Annalisa's a pediatrician in the NHS. We worked on that idea that social risk or social risk avoidance in the teenage years is a really big determinant of adolescent decision making.
And do we know what in terms of the individual differences in that context, right? Because of course, as we've touched on already, we too often focus on the average. What are the predictors of heightened sensitivity to social rejection?
That is a really good question, and it's not something that much is known about,
Mm.
actually. I mean, there is some evidence that girls are particularly sensitive to social rejection and being socially excluded, but I'm not sure. I wonder with the right kind of experimental designs and tasks, you'd find the same in boys, but just in different contexts. Because it's
Yeah,
not that
yeah.
boys are impervious to peer
Mhm.
influence. Of course, they're not. I wonder whether we've really just not using tasks and questionnaires that are sensitive to that. But yeah, and there are theories of mood changes in adolescent girls. So we know that adolescence is a sensitive period, a vulnerable period for the development of mental health problems.
Yeah.
Most mental health problems develop in adolescence, and that's particularly the case for adolescent girls who, after puberty, see on average across the population, see a big increase in the prevalence of
Mhm.
mood disorders like depression and anxiety and things like self-harm and eating disorders. And one idea is because adolescent girls are particularly sensitive to social rejection, and when they go through puberty, they start to be treated differently, they see themselves differently, they look differently, they're treated by the world differently, they become more cognitively aware of the social pressures placed on them by society and how they need to fit in, and that makes them more sensitive to peer rejection. That's an interesting theory. I mean, I think, evidence is being
Yeah, we
collected
need
on
to
that
explore
theory at the
that.
moment, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But actually, we're just recording this on the day the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey findings have been published. I think I've just seen something in the Guardian today. So I think it just came out today or yesterday. But now, obviously, more data highlighting that increase in young people's mental health problems. I think the latest stat is 1 in 4 young people in England, these are English only data, have a mental health condition. And of course, these surveys obviously all have their limitations, but that again is an increase since the last time the APMS survey, which was conducted. So again, it is a
I
worrying
mean,
trend.
that is a trend. It absolutely fits with data from, say, Tamsin Ford, who's the head of
Yeah,
psychiatry department in Cambridge, who's been collecting data on this on mental health in children and young people for the last 22 years, I think, and that data shows very, very clearly that there's been an increase in the prevalence around the same proportion of young people now self-reporting
yeah,
symptoms of mental health problems. Yeah.
yeah. And the other stat which really struck me really concerningly was that 25% of 16 to 24-year-olds in that sample in the APMS reported self-harm. Almost a third of girls at the same age or young women at the same age. So really, it
Well,
is concerning times.
self-harm has increased so much. I mean, this is now stepping outside my field. I don't work in this area at all, but I do read papers on it and talk to people like Tamsin and read your work on this kind of thing, suicidal thoughts and self-harm. That's increased so much in the last 15 years.
Yeah.
It's almost become in some young people's circles in some countries almost become kind of normalized, which is really, really frightening. And I do think, again, going back to peer influence and social contagion and social norms, that has something to do with it. And it's very worrying. It's a kind of worrying aspect of the peer influence tendency in adolescence.
I know. I mean, this is a wider conversation, not for today, I
Mm.
don't think, which is that as we've talked more about mental health problems and we to try to normalize it, or to trying to tackle stigma, it's find that balance between tackling stigma, which promotes help seeking, versus normalization, which obviously in some cases may facilitate. So it is a really difficult debate. I think the jury's still out on the nature of that relationship, I think so, but I think we could have a whole podcast on that alone. I want to bring us back though, Sarah-Jayne, 2 or 3 things before we bring the podcast to a close. One is
Yeah.
to go back to your this sort of advocacy work, and you mentioned parents and teachers. So I've read some of the stuff I think in the Times Education Supplement and elsewhere about you've pretty strong views on what we should be doing in education. Do you want to share some of those views?
Education affects the brain. That's what education is. The brain is hugely developing in adolescence. The adolescent brain has heightened neuroplasticity, making adolescence a time of increased learning and increased sensitivity to things like interventions and rehabilitation. So, in other words, education is super important during adolescence. But is our education system tailor-made to what we know about adolescent brain development. I'm not sure it is. I mean, our education system hasn't really changed for, well, I was going to say decades, but you could argue centuries. And yet our knowledge about adolescent brain development is very, very new. It's really only 20 years old that we've known that it's only been 20 years or 25 years that we've known that the adolescent brain changes at all. And at the same time, we've learned huge amounts about how the mind develops, so how cognitive processes, social behavior, creativity, that kind of thing develop alongside the developing brain. And education is still, well, I say still catching up. I don't really think it started to incorporate that new science at all yet, but it should do. Like, the science is there, it's ready to inform policy. There are many ways it could inform policy, but I think in this country, in the UK, one area that I've been interested in is exams and the huge prevalence of exams that young people now have to sit, the huge number of exams young people now have to sit, and children. I'm not just really talking about adolescents. But in adolescence in particular, young people now have to sit 2 sets of really big national exams. Well, so they have to sit GCSEs, and they then have to stay in some form of educational training and do more tests and training until they're 18. Now, GCSEs were brought in way before anything was known about brain development and cognitive development in adolescence, and they replaced O-levels, which were brought in as a leaving certificate when the vast majority of 15-year-olds left school after they did their leaving certificate, their O-levels. So they needed some form of certificate, some form of grading when they left school. But now young people have to stay in some form of training or education until 18. They don't arguably need that level of leaving certificate at 16. They could do something a lot less high stakes and a lot more kind of tailor-made to their brain development. And the other thing about GCSEs is that GCSEs, you know, I've had 2 kids who've gone through GCSEs in the last few years. They cram these young people with information that they have to then regurgitate in very, very large numbers of exams over a 2-month period. And they can do that, but that's short-term memory, and most of it is lost a few weeks or months later. And it's very stressful. So that, you know, you've got to question why it's beneficial is that really the right kind of education? Is that the optimal way to educate the developing teenage brain? And is it the optimal way to test the educated teenage brain? I'm not sure it is, but it's also the level of stress and anxiety and pressure that young people feel when they're doing their GCSEs. And that the age at which they're doing their GCSEs is the age at which young people are most vulnerable to mental health problems like depression. That's the peak age for the onset of depression. And you see that in the statistics. You see that young people do develop lots of different mental health problems at exactly that age. And then if you ask them what is causing their stress and what's causing them to feel low, if you ask them that one of the top responses is exam pressure and academic stress.
Yeah.
We should listen to them.
I know, and not just listen to them, of course, but also listen to the evidence. And actually, I speak as someone who lives in Scotland, and we have a slightly different system than in England. Whereas in recent years, you've moved even more towards exams under new curriculum development, and whereas actually we still have more of a balance between coursework and final exams, which I think is, I would say, more humane, is what I would say. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. Okay, a couple of things, Sarah-Jayne, before we finish. Really enjoying our chat. There are 2 other things I want to cover. One is, well, 3 things to be fair. One is on interventions. One is your new Welcome Discovery Award. And then we always end with a couple of questions, which I haven't told you about yet, at the very end, right? Which are unrelated to the topic, right? But they're sort of more reflective. So let's go with the intervention, or no, let's do the Discovery Award, and then what we do then on what does your knowledge and understanding lead to, or how does it inform intervention development? So let's do the Discovery Award though first.
I've told you that the neuroscience of brain development has demonstrated that the brain undergoes big changes in what we call macrostructure, grey matter and white matter, volume over adolescence. What we know a lot less about is how brain microstructure changes. That is the brain at the level of the axon, the fibers connecting up different brain cells, cell bodies, for example, because we haven't in the human brain had the technology to allow us to look at the brain at that level of resolution until recently, but we now are able to do that using firstly high field strength, so high Tesla MRI scanning, but also a special type of MRI scanner called a connectome scanner. There are only 3 connectome scanners in the world, one in Leipzig, one in Boston, and one in Cardiff that are currently up and running.
Right.
And we are collaborating with our colleagues Derek Jones and Mariana van den Brie in Cardiff and Rohia Kiewit at the Donders Institute in the Netherlands to with a new Wellcome Discovery Award to run quite a large cohort study on children and young people aged 8 to 18 who are going to be scanned 3 times as they grow up. And we're going to track changes in brain microstructure, so looking at the brain at a much fine-grained level of detail, and look at how the development of the brain's microstructure predicts other forms of development like cognitive development, educational attainment, and mental health development.
And so that's started. Has it started now?
It's just started, but it's going to be an 8-year project.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, excited to see what the outcomes of that are. And okay, and then the last thing before we do our last thing is on intervention. So what should we be doing? You were involved in the Myriad trial, which obviously this large national study on mindfulness in schools. And then and maybe you wanted to say a bit about that and obviously the findings of that. And then what we should be doing to support parents, kids, whatever, in adolescence.
Okay, so I work with Mark Williams and Willem Kaiken and Tim Dalgleish on a big 8-year study on a mindfulness intervention in secondary schools, so for kids aged 11 to 15. And this was all published a few years ago. Many, many papers came out of this work. And the upshot was that, unfortunately, the mindfulness intervention, this was a huge, huge study, the biggest of its kind globally, very, very well powered. The mindfulness intervention compared with a teaching as usual control intervention, but very balanced, very well powered study, showed no benefits on mental health of the mindfulness intervention compared with the control, contrary to our hypotheses. And I think the take-home message the message I would take home from that is that these kinds of universal interventions where we're really, really trying to, I mean, everyone wants to find a universal intervention where you give to the whole school as a preventative intervention. So you prevent mental health problems before they start surfacing. I mean, I'm still a hugely supportive of that idea that interventions are one thing, but prevention is really what you need to be looking for. But I think we have to rethink how we do those universal interventions in schools where we're giving the intervention to everyone, even people who are not at risk at all, people who are not interested at all, people who just don't think this is for them. I'm not sure that kind of universal intervention will work, certainly didn't for our mindfulness study, which was called the Myriad study. But there are 2 things to say. There are elements of mindfulness that seem to have. So mindfulness is a big thing. It involves lots of different practices and lots of different focuses. And there are elements of it. If you kind of disentangle the different elements, you can find elements of mindfulness that do seem to be beneficial to some young people. So there are elements, for example, around the attentional control, controlling your attention away from negative thoughts onto your breathing, for example, or decentering the ability to take a perspective and again, it's a bit related to attentional control. So you're not allowing rumination or negative thoughts to kind of take over your mind. There is some evidence that those elements work quite well with some people. But the main take-home message, and again, this is kind of interesting because we started the Myriad study in the year 2015. And since 2015, it's only 10 years, but huge amounts has been discovered since then about how young people develop and particularly their social development. And one thing that has been found is that young people respond better to interventions that are designed by and implemented by other young people than by similar interventions that are designed and implemented by adults. So there was one famous example by a group in the US on an anti-bullying intervention in schools. So just very briefly, they had a large number of schools. They randomly divided them into two groups. One group carried out their anti-bullying interventions as usual, carried out by the teachers. And in the other group of schools, children, young people aged between 11 and 15 were educated, a select group of young people were educated about the harmful effects of bullying. And then they were incentivized to run their own designed anti-bullying campaigns in their schools, like wristband campaigns, poster campaigns, debates, that kind of thing. And in the schools in which the anti-bullying campaigns were led by the young people themselves, the students, there was a 25% decrease in bullying incidents in the ensuing year, compared with the control schools in which the anti-bullying campaigns were led by teachers. That's also been found for other areas like anti-smoking campaigns. In other words, young people have a lot of influence over each other. And that should be capitalized upon. We should be allowing young people, we should be listening to them and allowing them to have a voice and empowering them to help each other or encourage each other to make positive, healthy decisions.
That's a great message. A great message. Okay, so if you want the listener or viewer, if you want to know more about the Myriad trial, we've also interviewed Willem Kuyten, and he's in a companion episode of the podcast. So, Sarah-Jayne, before I do the final, anything you thought we might talk about, or any key messages that we haven't communicated?
No, we've talked about everything.
That's you saying I want this to end. So
no, it's fine. It's fine.
Joking,
I don't mind.
I'm joking.
No, I like talking.
Okay, so Sarah-Jayne genuinely doesn't know I'm going to ask this question, which is,
oh no.
So what advice, we're talking about adolescence, so two last questions. So what advice would you give your adolescent self?
As an adolescent, I would have loved to know that the brain develops and continues to develop until the early to mid to late 20s. There are lots of individual differences in brain development, and that it will all settle down at some point. I would have loved to know that there's a kind of biological change going on in my brain that would continue for a long time, but would eventually settle down. That would have been really useful information. And I hope young people are learning about that now in their PSHE lessons.
That's good advice, but actually just struck me, another one's coming to my head related to that, based on something you said earlier about the different identities, right, at adolescence. So what was how would we describe the Sarah-Jayne Blakemore adolescent identity?
Well, I went through a goth phase, I went through a hippie phase, I went through a rave phase.
Okay.
I tried everything out. And I didn't even have social media to do
it. Okay, so on our very last question then is, somebody either living or dead, one or two people, it's up to you, who you'd like to have a coffee, dinner with, who you haven't had the opportunity to have thus far?
It's such a difficult question because there are so many people who I admire or I read about and think they would be so interesting to talk to. But I'd probably go with one of the suffragettes like Emmeline Pankhurst, because I really admire bold women who go out of their way to fight for a cause.
That's a great answer. Well, on that note, Sarah-Jayne, thanks so much for taking the time. Really fascinating conversation, and best of luck with the Wellcome Discovery Award. And really, hopefully, we can check in 8 years' time to see how that's going. And thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rory.